Hi, this is Victor Antonio, and welcome to my Cold Calling Success series. Now, this series is going to be a little different than what you're used to seeing me doing. I'm going to use a lot of slides, PowerPoint slides, on this series because there's a lot of scripts that I want to go through, and I want to show you what you need to be doing when making a cold call. Now, let's begin by talking about how do we get the appointment. And let's begin with the mindset. One of the things I always like to talk about is, let's get our mind right before we can get our calling right. So the first thing I want to talk about is sales and time management. And I want to refer to a study that was done by Tim Connor, who wrote a book called Soft Selling. And in his book, he talked about, what's the difference between poor sales performance and those who perform well. Well, let's go to the numbers because I think they're very revealing. What he found is that poor performers only spent 10% of their time on prospecting. In other words, going out and getting new business, or more specifically in our case, cold calling. And then he found out that 23% of their time was spent on sales presentations, another 15% on servicing others, 30% on administrative work, that's filling out paperwork, and 20% on travel, and the one that really got to me was 2% on self-improvement. In other words, they weren't investing any time in themselves. So then he said, well, what do great sales performance or performers look like in selling? Well, here's what he found. He found out that those who are very good at selling spend 45% of their time on prospecting, 45% of their time, 10% of their time on sales presentations, 20% on servicing others, and 5% on administrative work, and 10% on travel, and 10% on self-improvement. Now let's go ahead and put these two side by side. In other words, the difference between poor performers and great sales performers is the following. Again, on the left, you'll see 10% on prospecting, 23% on sales presentation, 15% of the time was spent on servicing others, 30% on administration, 20% on travel, and 2% on self-improvement. As compared to the great salespeople, people who hit their number, look at the difference. 10% on prospecting versus 45% on prospecting. Tell me that isn't a wake-up call. Now, 23% on sales presentation versus 10% on sales presentations, 15% on service to others, 20% on service to others. So again, customer service is still important, as you can see from this data. 30% on administration for poor performers, and 5% on administrative work. Now, this says two things to me. One is that management has to really work on making your job as a salesperson that much easier. In other words, reduce the administrative overhead. So salespeople, I'm on your side when it comes to too much paperwork when you should be selling. Look at the travel, 20% all the way down to 10%. In other words, only travel when you have to travel. And look at the last bullet point, 2% on self-improvement, poor performers, versus 10% on self-improvement for those who perform the best. In other words, as salespeople, you know this, I don't need to repeat this, we need to improve ourselves. Let's not wait for the company to train us, let's train ourselves. Now, I want to add one more study. There was a gentleman by the name of Schiffman who did an interesting study also, and his numbers were somewhat similar to what Connor found, and he found the following. That 45%, again, on prospecting. That's how much time good salespeople spend on prospecting. Now, this gentleman is Stephen Schiffman. He wrote a book called Cold Calling Techniques That Really Work. Great book. And look at his numbers. I wanted to add this one because it had 20% on product knowledge. I like to add that to personal improvement and self-improvement. So you should know your product. But then go to the last bullet point again. That 10% to 15% spent on self-improvement. So how much time are you spending every day working on yourself? Now, we're going to talk about prospecting in this video series, but I want you to always be cognizant of the fact that in order to get better at what you're doing, especially when you're cold calling or doing sales presentations or knowing your material, your product, being a domain expert, requires you to put in some effort, some time to improve yourself. So give that some thought, and let's go to the next video.